Okay, folks, I wanted to record a introductory crash course kind of video explaining the anatomy and operation of a sewing machine. Whether you're working with a domestic or home sewing machine like this one, or if you're working on an industrial sewing machine, the pieces, the parts, the anatomy of it, and the operation of the machine is essentially the same. And for those of you who may have never seen a sewing machine before, I want you to be aware of the terminology and the vocabulary that we use so that when you're speaking to myself or some of your other professors, you'll know what we're talking about when we mention some of the parts of the machine. This is one of my home sewing machines, a domestic machine. If you hear myself or another professor use the term domestic, we're referring to a machine like this. An all-in-one machine. This is my Singer Esteem I've had for about 14 years, and she has a few quirks to her, but she still works. She still gets the job done. A home machine, a domestic machine like this, will have a motor housed inside of the machine for its operation. So it makes this an all-in-one system where you can pick up the handle and pick up the whole machine and take it wherever you need to. It makes for a very convenient and portable system for sewing. This section here, this area up here above the sewing surface, is referred to as the head of the machine. And this little open area here is referred to as the throat or the harp of the machine. Now, the size of this throat or harp really doesn't matter unless you are considering a machine for yourself, for home use. Most of the time when you're working, you're going to have most of the fabric to the left of the machine. But in some cases, you may have to coil up your work, coil up all of your fabric, and bunch it through this throat space. When you're working on smaller designs, children's wear, or finer fabrics, thinner fabrics, a small throat space is okay for bunching up your work and sending it through along this side of the needle, the right side of the needle. But if you're working with larger fabrics, heavyweight fabrics, draperies, quilts, things like that, you may want a larger throat space, something larger to house a lot more fabric to have to push through if it comes to the point where you need to push the fabric through the right side of the machine. Now let's take a bit of a tour of this machine. I'm going to rotate her over here to the side. And you're going to see a big wheel here. This is the hand wheel. And this allows for manual operation of the machine. So I can turn this wheel even when the machine is not powered, is not turned on, and it will operate the machine. Now if I turn this back towards the front, I've got my hand here on the wheel, so you can see that. Take a look at the needle. You'll see it raise up and back down and back up. So I am essentially sewing on this machine. There's no thread in it, but I'm essentially sewing on the machine by just turning this wheel at the side. This allows for manual operation. It's for precision sewing. There are many, many times where you're going to want to operate the hand wheel on the machine when you want more precise sewing. You'll also find the power switch on my machine is down here. So I can turn the machine on and off. When I turn that on, you might see a light come on over there. I can turn it off. You'll see that light turn off. And just again, so you can see that, power switch on. There's the light, power switch off. So while I can operate the machine from the hand wheel, most people are going to be having both their hands here while sewing, and then we have to utilize a foot pedal to run the machine automatically. When the power is on to the machine, I can use the foot pedal to automatically run the machine. So if I move the camera down here under the table, you'll see I have a couple of foot pedals down here because I have a couple of machines. This gray pedal down here, this is the pedal for my machine. I'll turn the machine on, and then I will press on this foot pedal. You should hear the machine run. And however much pressure I place on that pedal, the machine will run faster or slower. More pressure, it will run faster. Less pressure, it'll run slower. It's a little squeaky. I need to oil her up a little bit. And back up here, I'll show you the needle. I'm going to put my foot on the pedal, press it down. Yeah, she needs some oil. She's a little squeaky. So the hand wheel is for manual operation and for precision sewing. The foot pedal will be for automatic operation when you just want to run the machine normally and keep both hands free to maneuver your fabric. For this particular machine, I have another knob here. This knob is my stitch selector. And if I turn the machine back towards the front, you'll see I have a variety of stitches available to me. Right now it's using stitch letter A, which is the straight stitch right here. And if I turn this knob, it will switch. There's the buttonhole stitch there. I can switch it back to A or B or whichever one of these stitches I want to use. Now, in all the 14 years that I've had this machine, I've used maybe 4 of these stitches. So again, if you are looking to purchase a sewing machine for home use, you can sew most of your garments with a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch, and a buttonhole stitch. That's usually all you really need. A stitch selector knob or stitch selection buttons, variety of stitches. This you are mainly going to see on domestic machines. Most domestic machines will have a series of stitches to allow you to sew a variety of styles. But again, you don't really need all of them unless you really like decorative stitches for some reason, especially for quilt work or free motion embroidery work or something like that. Okay, I'm gonna grab the camera and take you on a little bit more of a tour on this machine. I'll take you to the top of the machine. Here is my stitch length dial. I can change the length of my stitches. You'll see a series of numbers written on this dial. The smaller the number, the smaller the stitch. All the way down here to buttonhole stitches. You can see that little icon for the buttonholes. That is the buttonhole stitch, very small stitch. Number 1, 2, 3, and up to a number 4. Again, the larger the number, the longer the stitch. These numbers usually correspond to millimeters, so a number 1 stitch is about 1 millimeter long, number 2 stitch is about 2 millimeters long, and so on and so forth. Over here is my stitch width dial. Focus. I can turn this dial from 0 to 5. This will give me wider stitches, specifically when I'm working with zigzag or buttonholes. And if I turn this wheel, I'm going to show you the needle over here. Let me zoom in on that. There we go. There's that needle. I'm going to turn that stitch width dial. And you see the needle moving to center and back to the left. This is also a feature that you are mainly going to see on domestic machines that have all these different stitches that have stitch widths and whatnot. Next thing I want to show you on the front of this machine is this little guy here. You'll see a symbol that looks like a U-turn. This is for reverse stitching. You press this and hold it down, the sewing machine will sew backwards. So typically you're sewing forwards, your fabric is being pulled towards the back of the machine and your stitchers are going forward through the fabric. When you press and hold this lever, however, it will do the reverse and it will reinforce your stitches. You're using a reverse stitch, or sometimes referred to as a back tack, to secure your stitches while you're sewing. Now on the back of the machine here, you'll find 2 little posts. These are the thread spool spindles or posts, so thread post, thread spindles. Most machines will have at least 1 spindle, some will have 2. You can see that in my 14 years, I've used this spindle a lot. It's got a bunch of gunk on there from spools and spools and spools being wound around this post, and I hardly, if ever, use this post. You can have 2 spools of thread on the machine at once. One can be used for the sewing on a piece of fabric, while the other can be held in reserve for winding a bobbin. And we'll talk about this bobbin winding apparatus in just a moment. For the thread that does get used in the machine, there are a series of thread guides, one of which is the stitch tension. I'm going to see if I can zoom in here. You might see a little piece of metal in there. If I can turn it to the other side, there's a corresponding washer of metal on both sides down in this groove. It's built into the machine, but there are two washers of metal in here. The thread gets sandwiched in between those two tension discs, and this dial here can adjust how much tension is on the thread that goes through the machine. I have it set to auto. This is one of the first things you do when you get a brand new home sewing machine is you test the thread tension and set it, and don't touch it again. You very rarely need to adjust the tension on your machine, but if you're wondering what this knob is, it's for the thread tension. These guides continue down, and you'll see a series of arrows here. Continues down, curves back up and around through this groove, and then it hooks around this area again. Now, I'm gonna hold the camera as best I can and turn that wheel over on the side of the machine. And you're gonna see a little piece of metal stick up out of this groove. There it is. It's gonna come all the way up, and then it's gonna descend back down. And as I keep turning that lever, you'll see it come up and down, up and down, up and down. At the same time, you're gonna see that needle coming up and down, up and down, up and down. This is your uptake lever or take up lever. I'll zoom in on that so you can see that little operation. Your thread will get hooked into this, and as you operate the machine, the lever will come up and descend back down. So the term take up lever or uptake lever can be used interchangeably. So when you're sewing and you're working on your work down here, you want, and you're getting ready to take the fabric out of the machine, you want this take up lever to be all the way up. You want it to complete its cycle of descending down and coming back up. It'll make it much easier for you to remove your work from the machine. So as we continue the thread guides from the take up lever all the way down, you'll see another little arrow here to guide, to let me know where the thread goes. And then it comes down to the needle housing. So down here at the needle housing, here's my needle. You can see there's a little hole there at the bottom where my thread goes through, and then here's the full needle. Now the needle is usually held in by a small screw. I'm going to loosen this up with a tiny screwdriver, and I can take the needle out. I can replace it if need be. There we go. So that is what my home domestic needle looks like, and I can place it back in there. Push it all the way up as far as it will go into its housing, and then replace this screw to hold it in place. You'll see another device here that runs behind the needle. This is the presser foot. This is the presser foot. It presses down on the fabric and helps guide the fabric through the machine. Now I'm going to turn the machine just so you can kind of see it from profile. Again, here's my needle here. And this whole apparatus here is my presser foot. You can see a metal shaft here, this piece of metal right there. And then there is a quick release system. This whole thing right here is built in to the machine. So when I press on this lever in the back, you'll see this little part of the foot comes off. Most domestic machines will have a function like this to allow you to quickly exchange and interchange various presser feet depending on what operation you need. This is considered a low shank presser foot. From the bottom of the foot down here to where it attaches through this screw, this top of the foot here down to the bottom of the foot here is considered a low shank presser foot. Again, standard on domestic machines. There are times when you might want to remove this screw to take the whole apparatus off. Again, using my little screwdriver, I can take this whole thing off. Again, here is the full presser foot with the quick release lever. Now, why would you ever want to do that? Sometimes you want to put specialty feet on the machine. For example, a walking foot like this whole thing is a specialty sewing presser foot. And this piece of plastic here has to mount onto that piece of metal in there when it's properly installed, and this screw slides in to hold it in place. So in a case of using a specialty foot like this, you absolutely need to remove the entire presser foot, including this quick relief shank. But again, this is the low shank that I'm talking about on the presser foot. Let me put that back on there. Now you'll notice while I was putting that back on, this piece of metal that I'm attaching this presser foot to, this piece of metal here, you notice that going up and down, and I'll make that go up again, and I can bring it all the way down and back up. So back around at the front of the machine, you'll see a little piece of plastic sticking out here. This is the presser foot lever. I can lower this and it lowers my presser foot. I can raise it and it will raise my presser foot. This is how I get the fabric in and out of the machine. You have to raise this in order to slide the fabric underneath and lower it to engage the presser foot with your fabric. And when you're ready to remove the fabric after sewing, you raise the foot again and then remove your fabric. I'm going to remove this foot for right now so you can get a better view at what's going on underneath that presser foot. You should see on just about any machine these little rough pieces of metal, these rough strips of metal here. These are the feed dogs of the machine. These are coarse little rough pieces of metal. Some of them have a sawtooth pattern to them. This has more of a cross-hatched diamond type pattern on it. They're rough pieces of metal that grab the underside of your fabric and feed the fabric through the machine. So again, I'm going to operate the hand wheel so you can see what this is doing. Again, I'm turning the hand wheel towards me. Always turn the hand wheel towards you, towards the user. And you're going to see those feed dogs come up, push towards the back of the machine, and then descend back down out of the way. And then they slide forward, come back up, they slide to the back, and then descend back down. So when the machine is operating, these are coming up, they're feeding the fabric through the machine, and then they disappear back down. Again, I'm turning my hand wheel towards me. This is the operation that the machine would go through if I were running it with the foot pedal. And when you couple this with a presser foot, once the foot is down, that's a very tight connection between the bottom of your foot and the tops of these feed dogs. So your fabric gets sandwiched between these two pieces of metal, and it forces the fabric through the machine from the front to the back of the machine over and over and over again. So again, the feed dogs are called such because they feed the fabric through the machine. You shouldn't have to push your fabric through the machine. You should never be forcing your fabric through the machine. You need to let the feed dogs do the job for you. If for some reason it's not operating, it's not moving, it may be a case of the fabric is too thick or the feed dogs aren't engaged properly, and that's when you need to call on me or one of the sewing technicians to find out what's going wrong. Now, you notice that those feed dogs are descending and raising through some grooves in this piece of metal here. This is your plate. This is referred to as the needle plate, the throat plate, or the feed dog plate. Lots of names. It's just it's a metal plate. So if anyone mentions the feed dog plate, needle plate, this is what we're talking about, this piece of metal right here. It allows the needle to descend down and the feed dogs to oscillate through. And if you look from the front of the machine, this plate has a series of grooves to the right of the needle. These are seam guides. This particular machine has imperial seam guides. The presser foot is 1/4 inch from the center of the foot to the edge of the foot. This first guide will give me an extra 1/8 of an inch. So if I'm sewing down the center of my foot and I put the edge of my fabric on the edge of my presser foot, that'll give me a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If I put the edge of my fabric here, it'll give me an extra 1/8 of an inch, giving a 3/8 seam allowance. This would give me a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and so on and so forth. So you can use these as guides to line up the raw edge of your fabric to give you a proper seam allowance. Now right here on my machine, I have an accessory box. Again, this is more common with domestic machines. I can just slide it right out. And if I open it up, you'll see a big mess of presser feet and bobbins. And this is usually where my screwdriver, my tiny screwdriver, gets housed. There are other presser feet in here. Again, this is fairly standard with domestic machines to have some kind of accessory box that can house all the different pieces and parts that's easily removable. Another reason that it gets removed is it allows a little bit more free motion when you're sewing, especially if you're sewing a round thing like the wrist on a sleeve, a cuff on a sleeve or something, you're sewing in the round. Trying to get your work over this flat surface can sometimes be difficult. This gives you a little bit more of a small work surface that you can work your fabric around. But having this detachable accessory box also serves another purpose. Over here is a little latch that I can pull down. And this brings us to the last part of the machine, is the bobbin housing. So everything going on in here, all these metal bits and pieces, there's all kinds of gears and things and knobs that twirl around in here. This is the bobbin housing. Inside of it is this piece of metal here with this little arm on it. This is the bobbin case. To remove it, I'm going to raise this lever with the tip of my finger, going to pinch that lever with my thumb and forefinger, pull the whole thing out. It should slide out easily so long as you are holding on to this little lever. Do not force this lever to open too much further. It will only open a certain amount, just enough for you to slide your finger in and pull it out. Again, I can slide that back in. When you're placing it in, you push it till it clicks, and to remove it, lift up this lever, pinch, and then pull this out. So this is my bobbin case for this particular machine. It has a special little arm on it, which is doesn't really serve any purpose actually. You will find bobbin cases of a variety of sizes, but again, the build is essentially the same. Some will have arms on them, some will not. If I turn this around, you'll see in here I have a bobbin spool. So this is kind of like those nesting dolls. It's a bobbin housing that houses the case that houses the bobbin spool. So you got to put the spool into the case and then both go into the housing. So here's my bobbin spool. I've got some black thread wound on there, and you can take another look at this particular bobbin case. It's got a little spindle in there so I can easily slide the bobbin onto it. But you'll also notice, and this is important, there's a groove. I'm going to set my bobbin aside. There's a groove right here on the edge of the bobbin case. And along this side of the case, you'll see there's nothing on here. It's just flat metal here. But over here, you'll see a piece of metal with a screw on it. When you're threading your bobbin, and we'll get to that in just a moment, you want to make sure that when it's properly threaded, the thread goes through this groove, under this flap of metal, and clicks into place so it sits in this hole here. If it is not thoroughly engaged under this piece of metal, you're going to end up with messed up stitches, and you're going to wonder what's happened. The bobbin needs to be inserted properly by going through this groove and under this piece of metal. I'll show you that one more time. I'm going to take my bobbin with my thread spooling to my right, comes over into my right, drop it into the case, grab the bobbin thread, slide it through that groove, under this little piece of metal until it clicks into place in that hole. That bobbin is ready to go. And then again, placing it into the machine, it should slide in. This little arm should stay up in this particular machine, and just push it until it snaps. Now let's take a look at the bobbin winding apparatus. The top of this machine holds the bobbin winding apparatus. You will thread one of these, put a spool of thread onto one of these posts. You can see in this diagram the thread wraps around these tension. This is a tension spool right here, a tension post. So the thread will spool in between, it will slide between this little flat piece of metal and this round piece of metal, and it loops around. You place your empty bobbin onto this spindle here, and then push it until it says wind. So this machine, once it's set to wind and you turn the machine on and press the pedal, this spindle will spin and it will fill your bobbin. So the bobbin winding mechanism is at the top of this machine. So you can wind new bobbins. You can place your new top thread here. You can wind your bobbin from here if you wish. You can have both spools. That pretty much covers all of what's going on with this standard machine. Now I'm going to thread the machine and give you an overview of what's happening when you're sewing on a machine like this. Okay, I've gone ahead and threaded the top of my machine. There is some thread going all the way through the machine, and you can see it. It's attached here, some white thread attached to my needle. There's the end of my needle there with the thread coming through it. I removed my presser foot just so it's not a distraction, but I'm going to again manually turn my hand wheel so you can see how the needle descends below this throat plate, and you'll see the thread get hooked underneath here. So watch carefully. I'm going to turn my hand wheel. I'm holding onto my thread. Make sure when you do this, because you are going to have to do this a lot, make sure you're holding onto your thread so that it doesn't get caught down in the bobbin housing. I'm going to turn my wheel. You're going to see a lot of metal spinning around in here. These kinds of machines are mechanically timed. They're timed precision tuning to make sure that they're timed properly to catch the thread that's in the needle and then hook it around. You'll start to see a piece of thread right over here. It's going to hook around the bobbin housing. You can see now it's pushing over here, and it will get released. So here's my thread. It's coming from my needle down past the throat plate. It just got looped around the side, and it's going to get caught here on this little spindle. I'm just going to remove that so I can pull it out. I'll show you that one more time. Holding the thread in my hand up here, I'm going to turn my crank. You'll see the needle descend through the plate. It's going to get caught by the hooks in that bobbin housing. There you see the thread start to appear. It hooks around over the entire housing and then lets loose. Now I'll show you what that looks like when I have the bobbin case installed. I have just the empty bobbin case. I'm not going to put a bobbin in it quite yet. This is just the empty case. Press that in, install that. Again, one more time, holding the top thread letting it descend down. It gets caught by the bobbin hooks. You're going to see that thread start to appear over here on the right. Goes around the entire bobbin case. You can see it just looped around, and then it comes back up. This is essentially all the machine is doing every time you're running the machine. When you're working with a home machine or an industrial straight stitching machine, this is what's happening. There's metal pieces and metal hooks that spin around and around and around the bobbin case. The top thread descends below the plate. The hooks grab that thread, loops it around the entire bobbin case, and hooks back up through the throat plate. Now, I'm going to put a bobbin into my bobbin case. Again, I've got the thread going over and down to the right, so it looks like a number 9. Drop that into the case, pull the thread through this little groove and under this piece of metal so that my thread is sitting properly underneath this piece of metal, and it's coming out through this little hole here. So again, through that groove, under this piece of metal until it snaps into place in that little hole. And now I'm going to leave a bit of a tail. You want to leave a few inches of thread hanging out. I'm going to push that back into the machine, snap it in place. And the exact same process, I'm going to hold my top thread. I am not putting my foot on the pedal or anything. I'm just going to turn that hand crank. So this is a two-handed process. Hold your top thread, turn your hand crank. Watch the needle go all the way down. It's going to go through the throat plate. The hook is going to grab it, wrap it around the bobbin housing. There's my white thread from the top of my machine. Hooks around, and you'll see it just caught my bobbin thread, my black bobbin thread. You just saw that bobbin thread move. I'm going to grab onto that. Let the machine continue its cycle. The needle is all the way up. I can see that my uptake lever is all the way up, and surprise, surprise, here is my bobbin thread at the top of my machine, at the top of my throat plate. I now have 2 lines of thread that I can work with, I can sew through. Show you that one more time. I'm going to remove my bobbin, again, picking up the bobbin by its lever. The lever is there for a few reasons. Not only does it allow you to grab onto it to pull it out, it also acts as a hook. It kind of hooks in to the bobbin spool inside. So when I don't have it engaged, the spool is going to drop right out. But if I do lift this lever and hold it, that bobbin doesn't come out. It holds and locks the bobbin in place. That way you can pull it out of the machine without your bobbin falling out and falling into the machine. So I've got the bobbin back in. I'm going to place it back into its housing. Hold the top thread, turn my hand crank, my hand wheel slowly. You'll see that top thread, the white thread, appear on the right. It's going to scoop around the bobbin housing. It's going to scoop up my bobbin thread at the same time. I'm going to keep turning my crank until I see the needle is all the way up and my uptake lever is all the way up. If you don't see your bobbin thread coming through, you can just tug on your top thread and it'll come right out. Do that one more time and I'll show you what happens when the bobbin thread doesn't come all the way up. One more time real quick, down and back up. Let's say we get to this point, the bobbin thread hasn't fully come up. I can just grab my top thread, pull on it, and the bobbin thread comes with it. This again is the same operation that happens when you're sewing. And just so you are aware, I'm going to go ahead and put my foot on the pedal. I'm going to, do not do this on the machines. I'm just showing this for demonstration. I'm going to firmly hold both of these threads and you will see this same operation happen over and over and over again as I operate the machine with the foot pedal. I wish I could slow down the video. But you should see that white thread looping over and over and over and over again. And notice what's happened to my threads. I have white thread on the top of my machine, and black thread as my bobbin. And you're going to see that they're kind of twisted on each other. Every time you make a revolution on a sewing machine, the top thread comes down, it hooks the bobbin thread and pulls it back up. And it creates this kind of image. It creates this kind of shape where the top thread is hooked and the bottom thread is hooked together. This is a lock stitch. It's considered a lock stitch because the two threads lock into each other with every stitch. So you will hear the term straight stitch and lock stitch in reference to the machines that we have on campus, because that is the only stitch that they will do. Now I'm going to very quickly do a single line of stitching so you can see what this lock stitch looks like on fabric. I'm going to replace my accessory box. I'm going to put my needle into my work, press my foot pedal, raise my foot pedal, raise my presser foot, remove my work, clip my threads on both ends. So there's the white thread from the top of my work. That's my top thread. Here's the black thread. That's the bobbin. That's the bottom of my work. So I place it in the machine like this so I could see these stitches from the top. These stitches were going on the bottom. Just have to hope that those are working. But this was the top of my thread in white, bottom of my thread with black. And if I pull this fabric apart, these two pieces of fabric apart, see if we can see that lock stitching in there. One side should lock into the other. It's a little bit noticeable here. This tiny little stitch here. You should see a little bit of white thread and a little bit of black thread. That's where the top thread has looped and locked into the bottom thread. And it does that with every single stitch. The top thread loops and locks in with the bottom thread. So if I pull this really tight, you can see all those individual little stitches holding both pieces of fabric together. And this is essentially a seam. This is how you start sewing garments or any other designs together. This is how you put two pieces of fabric together, by placing an allowance of fabric to one side, sewing through both layers, and pull it apart and flatten it out nice and press it nice and finish. Now you have the start of seam making for sewing.